Okay, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to be covering chapter 12, as you can see. And this is the chapter that covers psychological disorders. Sometimes you'll see this chapter referred to as abnormal psychology or psychopathology or something along those terms. But all of those terms are more or less interchangeable. But we're going to be looking at sort of the mental illness side of things, that side of the coin for psychology. And so chapter 12 is sort of the looking at the diagnosis portion, looking at how do we classify and diagnose different disorders. Chapter 13 is going to be how do we treat those disorders. And one thing I really want to mention before we get going is if you're reading this chapter or you're listening to me to talk about this chapter, if things sound familiar, if things start to hit home, I want you to be really careful and not engage in forms of self-diagnosis based off of what you hear in this PowerPoint, because we're only sort of scratching the surface on what mental illness is. There's not enough information here to really to provide you with a self-diagnosis. And again, I mean, I'm not a medical professional and neither are you. Well, I'm assuming you're not. Maybe you're a doctor listening to this, but I would be really surprised by that. But more than likely not, you probably aren't. So if you are concerned about your mental health, by all means, seek out professional help. You're a general practitioner, a psychiatrist, a counselor, whomever, whatever your insurance will allow you to see. But your medical information, your medical diagnoses, and all that stuff should not come from here, is what I'm saying. So the goal of this chapter is we're going to be looking at what psychological disorders are, sort of defining what they are. We have a pretty strict criteria that we use for defining disorders. Then we're going to switch gears and look at specific disorders. We're going to look at we'll look at anxiety disorders. We'll look at obsessive compulsive disorder and related disorders. Also trauma and stress related disorders. All of these used to be kind of lumped together in one big class as anxiety disorders, but now they're kind of broken into separate classifications. We'll look at dissociative disorders, somatic disorders, mood disorders, including depression and bipolar, schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. We'll then finally look at personality disorders. So we're going to cover a wide span of different classifications of disorders. Again, this is not an exhaustive coverage of mental health issues, but it's just a nice preview of kind of what is to come. And I'm pretty sure, a lot of institutions will have full courses dedicated to this particular topic. And I believe OSU OKC is one of those. If you're a student listening to this and you're from OSU OKC, there's a chance that you could, broaden your knowledge of the subject even more if you are interested. So before we move on, I just want to think about what we talked about in Chapter 11. We talked about stress and the impact on physical and mental health. So if you don't mind, go ahead and pause the video and maybe jot some thoughts down or think aloud or type up some thoughts about, what you think the impact of chronic stress, like experiencing stress over and over again, what that does to our health physically and mentally. Go ahead and pause the video and jot some thoughts down. Okay, welcome back. You should have, if you're really being honest about this, you should have wrote about how, really chronic stress over time has a really negative, detrimental impact on our health, our physical and mental health. Stress in short bursts can be okay. It's not really unhealthy for us, and sometimes it can be very motivating, but when we are just perpetually stressed, it can be toxic to the body, leading to heart disease, depression, weight gain, destruction of your telomeres of your genes, so you age more when you're stressed. So many health impact, anxiety, all kinds of things are impacted by chronic stress. So here's our truth or fiction items. If you'd like, pause the video and maybe test yourself. Which ones do you think are true? Which ones do you think are false? And we'll kind of we'll check them as we go along. Okay, go ahead and pause the video. All right, welcome back. Okay, first truth or fiction item, we're jumping right into it. Anxiety is abnormal. What do you think? Pause the video. Truth or fiction? Okay, welcome back. It's actually fiction. Anxiety is actually pretty normal. It's a normal experience. I mean, a lot of us have anxiety on a daily basis, which might be getting into the realm of some kind of disorder, but just experiencing anxiety in general, or worry, or being nervous is a pretty normal human experience. I mean, let's say, you know, even if you study really well for a test, and if it's a big test, you're probably still going to have some anxiety, some worries, some doubts, but that's fairly normal. It's when it becomes chronic, and when it starts interrupting your ability to your normal daily routine or your life functioning, things like that, that's when it becomes problematic and when it becomes abnormal. But normal worries and anxieties are fairly normal. So psychological disorders, there is a pretty strict classification of how we're going to define a disorder. A disorder has to meet the categories of the 3Ds, meaning it has to be pretty, it has to be deviant behavior, meaning it's pretty rare and unusual behavior. But that by itself is not enough explanation. There are a lot of behaviors out there that are pretty rare and unusual, but don't obviously count as a disorder, like a psychological disorder. I think of anybody who can dunk a basketball. I mean, the vast majority of the people on this planet probably cannot dunk a basketball. It's a pretty rare ability. It's a pretty rare behavior, but by no means would we go, oh, everybody who can dunk a basketball has some kind of disorder. No, it's the rest of us who probably have the disorder. We're short, or we're not, you know, we don't have a good jumping ability or whatever. You know, it's not quite that simple. But it also has to cause distress. The disorder also has to lead to distress, meaning it's not pleasant. You know, it's, you know, again, anxiety can be motivating, but it's not really a pleasant experience. Same thing with depression. You know, depression can be very motivating, but again, chronically, depression is not an enjoyable experience emotionally, physically, etc. And then finally, it has to be, so we have deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional, meaning it kind of impairs your ability to function normally, and potentially you're engaging in self-defeating behaviors that are dangerous or even unacceptable in some cases when we talk about dysfunction. So the 3Ds, deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional, are how we think about disorders. You know, they have to meet all three in order to be diagnosable. Okay, next truth or fiction question. We're coming hot and coming fast already. A man shot the president of the United States in front of millions of TV witnesses and was found not guilty by a court of law. What do you think? Pause the video. It is in fact true. Welcome back. It is true. We're going to talk more about the specific case and the implications of why this person was not convicted or found guilty. It's a very important case and a very important moment in our history that maybe many of you didn't know about. This, we're talking about President Ronald Reagan, obviously born before many, or president before many of you were probably even born, myself included. I was born in '88. I think Reagan's last year of being president, so I don't remember Ronald Reagan at all, but I do remember seeing this on television, seeing like this talked about historically speaking, not actually live. Okay, so a few different perspectives about how we thought about mental illness. It's really evolved over the years. I mean, if we go back pretty far in our history, and we're talking about, you know, in the last few hundred years, up until probably the last 100 or 200 years or so, we used to think of mental illness as being caused by demons, being sort of this demonological model of mental illness, thinking that people who are mentally ill are possessed. So a pretty outdated way of thinking, very much tied to sort of religious and spirituality, up until, you know, maybe about until recently. I mean, actually, I would say the still prevailing perspective is somewhat influenced by the medical model. This idea that mental illness is like physical illness and can be treated as such. We can treat it with drugs. We can treat it with surgery, like any other illness. But now we see a much more modern understanding, which sort of embraces this medical model, but also takes into account the diathesis stress model, which says that, hey, some of us are better equipped to deal with stress than others, biologically speaking. Maybe some of us are more resilient, biologically speaking. And sort of adding on to that, mental illness is a biopsychosocial phenomenon, meaning it's influenced by factors that come from our biology, our psychology, what's going on between our ears, and also our social settings. So it's a number of factors that are attempting to explain mental illness. Psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, etc., anybody who's involved in diagnosing mental illnesses will typically use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5. It is created by the APA, the American Psychiatric Association. It is a giant book that is used, again, by insurance companies and medical companies to code and diagnose mental illness. And I don't know why they don't include a picture here, but it's a pretty large book. It's blue. It's not an entirely very exciting book as far as like the cover or the contents, but it's a very interesting book. So how common is mental illness? You know, about 1 in every 2 people, 50%, will experience some kind of mental illness or psychological disorder at some point in their life. More often than not, that happens during childhood or adolescence. So, hey, if you've made it through adolescence, you're an adult and you're doing fine, and you made it through this time, hey, pat yourself on the back. There's a greater likelihood that you've sort of already passed that point of your life. But you know, it doesn't mean it couldn't happen. But good to know at least. And then about 1 in 4, about 25%, maybe a little higher, will experience a psychological disorder at any given year. So it is a very important health issue we're talking about. If 1 in 4 people any given year, 1 in 2 people throughout their lifetime will develop a mental illness, I mean, that's probably higher than rates of other, disorders or other illnesses that we think about that are, that are large. Maybe even like the flu. I don't know what the data on the flu says. But here are some rates of the disorders. We're looking at anxiety disorders versus mood. You know, this is really interesting. The median age of onset, kind of typically when you see it develops, pretty young for anxiety disorders, a lot older for mood disorders, bipolar disorder, substance abuse. Any disorder about 14 years of age is kind of when you see the onset. So anyway, some pretty interesting data here. So this is John Hinckley. He is the man I spoke about in the a previous slide, the man who shot at President Reagan, actually shot President Reagan, didn't kill President Reagan from his shot. However, it wasn't a fatal shot, thankfully. But he was not convicted via the M'Naughton rule, or the insanity plea, where the defendant didn't understand what he or she was doing at the time. And just didn't realize it was wrong. So this is a monumental case as far as like mental health and how we treat people with mental health on the criminal justice side of things. So really fascinating case. Surprised it doesn't get talked about more than it actually already does. Okay, and probably because it's so rare, that probably has a lot to do with it too. It's only raised in about 1% of cases. In fact, it's probably even hard. Then we talk about, well, it gets raised. Well, then how, it's pretty infrequent when it actually gets, when it's used correctly, or used successfully, I should say. Okay, so the first classification of disorders that we're going to look at are anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are, when we talk about anxiety disorders of any sort, it's almost always revolving around worry or dread or fear of some sort, typically, either it's the specific fear or worry about something, or it's just a very general, broad fear. So, those are kind of the psychological symptoms that underpin almost all of these disorders. Physically speaking, we're talking about arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. You're chronically in fight or flight. You're experiencing those symptoms of fight or flight. Your heart is racing, excuse me. Physically you might be trembling and sweating, all kinds of things that we see typically in fight or flight. So some specific types of anxiety disorders are phobias. For example, we've talked about before, like claustrophobia, agoraphobia. These are just irrational fears about specific things. Again, these are typically learned experiences, and luckily they can be sort of unlearned. We're also learning more and more about a very common phobia known as social phobia or social anxiety disorder. And this is sort of a fear of being in social situations, either public speaking, going on dates, speaking in front of people in general. I mean, it encompasses a wide swath of fears. So we're finding out it's becoming a lot more common. And actually, I think it's becoming one of the most commonly diagnosed anxiety disorders. So these are specific worries. So when we talk about that fear or worry or nervousness, and when we talk about phobias, it's directed in a specific area or specific item or object. Panic disorder is, having panic attacks where you have these very quick onset of anxiety attacks where it may become very difficult to breathe. It may feel like you're choking or lightheaded or you're about to faint. If you've ever seen the show The Sopranos with Tony Soprano, that is a pretty good example of kind of what panic attacks are like. There's just sudden, sometimes they're triggered by specific things that the person is aware or not aware of. but in the moment they may feel like they're dying. They may feel that shortness of breath, and it kind of compounds the issue because, oh my gosh, I can't breathe, so I'm panicking even more, and it goes, those people maybe in some sense, lose consciousness because they faint, and that's not always the case, but you can kind of see how it spirals quickly if a person doesn't learn how to take care of it. Generalized anxiety disorder is this general worry about sort of anything and everything. It is persistent anxiety. It's not necessarily tied to any specific thing. It could be worrying about, worrying about my grades. I'm worried about my future. I'm worried about, did I leave the oven on? I'm worried about, how much time I have. It's worried about everything. And you're just kind of perpetually in this fight or flight. And in fact, it's the most commonly diagnosed disorder of the anxiety disorders that we've talked about so far. So it's typically what you see most people when they talk about anxiety is generalized anxiety. Here are some perspectives about where these disorders come from a psychological view. We talk about anxiety, or for example, phobias are learned experiences. We either learn them through our own or for observing other people's. Cognitively speaking as well, sometimes we over amplify a situation as a threat when it really isn't. How we appraise something, cognitively speaking, we appraise situations as being more threatening than others. From a biological standpoint, we see, anxiety is also tied to genetics. We see, so it's a lot like most of these disorders we're going to talk about. If you have a prevalence, if mom or dad has anxiety, you are much more likely to develop those disorders yourself. Biopsychosocial, our big fancy term we're going to throw out now pretty frequently in this chapter, is that anxiety is where we experience anxiety from a wide variety of interactions between the genetics we inherit, our social surroundings, and kind of all the things that are going on between our ears. Related to anxiety disorders, but no longer classified, is obsessive compulsive disorder, and this is two parts. There are obsessions and there are compulsions. So obsessions are the thoughts, compulsions are the behaviors, but obsessions are these kind of reoccurring anxiety-provoking thoughts or images or beliefs that are hard to control for an individual. So they may obsess about cleanliness, or they may obsess about the safety of their family or the safety of their loved ones, for example. And this leads to compulsive behaviors, which are just urges that, if they follow through with these behaviors, they'll tend to reduce the anxiety. So someone who has a fear of their own safety, for example, may choose to lock the door of their house, X number of times in order to feel safe. It rids them of that anxiety. Or they'll wash their hands X number of times to rid themselves of that fear of, being not clean, for example. But I want to make one thing clear. OCD is not simply liking things clean or liking things neat or straight. That's not the case. I really hate when people say that, because for people with OCD, it's a very unpleasant experience. So, it's one thing to like things to be clean, and, most of us probably like things to be clean, but that doesn't mean we have an anxiety disorder or a disorder that causes lots of suffering. So be careful how you use those words. Hoarding disorder is related to OCD. In fact, it kind of falls under the same umbrella, and this is where people they obsess about sort of hoarding certain items, and they have a really tough time of letting those items go. Similar disorders might be body dysmorphic disorder, where people have this obsession about certain things on their body as being either a real or an imagined defect, where they might, want to change something about their body. They might engage in like hair pulling, skin picking. They might engage in cosmetic surgery that's unnecessary, for example. Another class of disorders that's kind of related to OCD, also related to anxiety disorders, or PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a response to traumatic events, and it doesn't have to necessarily be traumatic in the sense of seeing combat or being involved in combat like we typically think about PTSD. It could be any sort of traumatic event. If you were attacked, like say you're on your way home from work and you were trying to go to your car and somebody attacked you and robbed you or something, that would be a traumatic event. A natural disaster destroying your home or your neighborhood or your loved one's home, or things like that could be traumatic events. And this is kind of, PTSD. Some common symptoms are where you're having these reoccurring flashbacks about the particular traumatic event, difficulty sleeping, lots of anxiety, depression are also associated with this disorder. A minor version of PTSD is called acute stress disorder, and this is typically in response to maybe a traumatic or stressful event, but it typically just doesn't last as long as PTSD. We're only talking about maybe a couple weeks or maybe even a month. After 9/11, we can see symptoms of PTSD in terms of like the sleeping patterns of people who, not just people who lived in New York City, but Americans in general. That's one of those events that kind of affected so many different people that it's easy to see, so many people watched that event on television and so many people feared for their own safety as a nation afterwards, that we can see, rates of sleep, having sleep problems going up pretty, I don't know about significantly, but, substantially it looks like from this graph. Okay, quick comprehension check, and we'll move on. Sudden episodes of extreme anxiety and terror that involve symptoms such as heart palpitations, trembling, sweating, and fear of losing control are characteristic of which anxiety disorder that we've talked about so far? Pause the video. What do you think? Welcome back. I would say we're talking about panic disorder. It's sudden, it's extreme anxiety, it's terror. You're kind of going through those fight or flight symptoms. Fear of losing control is part of it as well. So panic attacks, sometimes it's associated with agoraphobia as well. Kind of fear of being in somewhere you lose control is very common. So panic disorder is the disorder I was thinking of here. All right, dissociative disorders are quite interesting. They're quite the interesting category of disorders. These involve the splitting of mental processes or splitting of consciousness, typically of identity, emotions, consciousness, things like that. So we're getting into the realm of like multiple personalities. So this is where we get specifically to DID, dissociative identity disorder. Also, it used to be referred to as multiple personality disorder. This is where you have two or more identities that reside within a single person. Typically, the identities are also very unique. You might even have different genders, different ages, all kinds of different characteristics of these different identities built into one person. In fact, it becomes so strange that it's hard for people to believe that it's even real. Because people act so differently in these different identities, and sometimes even when they're in one identity, they're almost blacked out and unaware of what's going on with the other identity, and so you get into cases where people who claim that they black out and don't remember something that happened, and it's because their other identity sort of took over and engaged in very risky behaviors like alcohol use, gambling, unprotected sex, things like that, or not necessarily unprotected, but just more casual, more frequent sexual acts than maybe their promiscuous sex, I guess you should say. So that's where that could become a problem. Sometimes people will self-harm in one identity and not remember, and so it can be very, very scary in that sense. This is a famous movie with Halle Berry. I actually haven't seen it. Actually, let me check. I don't remember even the name of the title of the movie. I'm sorry. It is Frankie and Alice. Sorry, Frankie and Alice is the movie if you're interested. You can learn a little more about DID. But I've never seen the movie, so I can't vouch for how good it is. But check it out if you're looking for something to watch. Dissociative amnesia. This is where somebody sort of has a period of amnesia, typically following. It's not due to some kind of head trauma, and this is typically followed it usually follows some kind of traumatic event where a person will have a difficulty remembering who they are as a person. There's an example from Breaking Bad, the show, where Walter White fakes like he has this dissociative amnesia, but again, he's faking it, so it's not real. But if you want to learn kind of what doctors are looking for, then watch the episode of Breaking Bad. It's in season 1 or 2, I think. Depersonalization, derealization disorder. This is where people sort of feel like they're kind of floating unattached from themselves. They're kind of feeling like, they're just really not themselves. And again, this is typically following up. You see all of these disorders we've talked about so far, dissociative disorders, typically are in response to some kind of traumatic event. They're kind of a way for us psychologically to deal with really traumatic events like maybe sexual assault or some kind of traumatic event that we're not really quite sure how to put into words or understand fully. Again, these are, kind of already talked about the origins. And a lot of times it's related to disturbing or traumatic memories or thoughts that are really hard to get. Interestingly enough, we really only see this in the Western world, specifically in North America, the United States, and Canada. So that really also gives rise to this idea that, okay, is this real or not? Well, it's definitely real, because there are also other disorders that are found in other countries that are not found here, for example. So just because it's not found somewhere else doesn't necessarily mean it's not real, but it also means it's very much tied to our culture rather than something that's sort of innate. Somatoforms disorders, these are disorders where the mind is affecting the body. For example, somebody is experiencing so much stress or so much maybe psychological pain or stress that it's beginning to affect their body abnormally. For example, they might experience limb paralysis or blindness or pain for no specific, physical reason, for example. It's typically linked to stress and traumatic events, like a lot of things, like, stress. Our body reacts to stress psychologically sometimes. So there's illness anxiety disorder, and this is where also what we used to call people being hypochondriacs, where they have this intense fear of being sick, but they really don't have medical evidence to justify it, so they go off and seek multiple opinions. There's conversion disorder, where psychological disorders convert into physical illness. For example, like somebody who is so stressed out by something, their arm goes numb, or one of their eyes stops working. And there's a funny episode of King of the Hill where Hank accidentally walks in on his mom having sex with her new husband, and it shocks him so much, the sight of it, that he goes blind, and there's no physical reason, and he doesn't get his sight back until he comes to grip with what happened. So pretty funny episode, but it's kind of an interesting example of conversion disorder. Okay, again, where do these come from? Again, some theorists believe it's sort of this form of self-hypnosis, that we kind of convince ourselves of this physical problem that may or may not be there, and it may be tied back to anxiety issues, this idea of perfectionism and other factors that are at play. But again, it's a biopsychosocial phenomenon. So with that, we're going to stop. We're going to wrap up in the next video. We'll cover the second half of chapter 12 in another video. I don't want to overload you with too much, so let's stop here and call it good. But anyways, we'll pick up with chapter 12 in another video, and I'll see you on the next one.